Good morning. So this video is going to be a presentation. It's going to have a couple of things. First, we will recap the foundational documents for the AP US Government and Politics course up until this point. And then we're going to look at our newest foundational document, Federalist 51, which is going to deal with worries about groups becoming tyrannical and utilizing their power to oppress minority groups. And by minorities, we're talking about any group that is outside of the majority within the country. Okay, so thus far we have covered 5 foundational documents. And we're going to recap the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution, Brutus No. 1, and Federalist 10. In this video, very briefly, and just focus on the key ideas from those particular documents. So our first document is the Declaration of Independence, 1776, by Thomas Jefferson. And really the main ideas that relate to AP government and particularly the essay question are these 2 ideas. The first one is the idea of political equality, outlined through the phrase all men are created equal. So often there'll be a question about what did the founders think about this topic. And if it's an equality-based topic, you'd say, well, in the Declaration of Independence, they were heavily in favor of equality. The second thing is that at all times the government should try to reflect the views of the citizens. This is the concept of consent of the governed. And once again, we have a question about elections or something along those lines, or interest groups and such. Say the government should try to reflect the views of the citizens. The Articles of Confederation, the first attempt at an independent government in the United States, in which there was a very limited national government and strong states, reflect those 2 ideas, that state sovereignty in the country, the states should have a lot of power to reflect the local views and preferences of their citizens. And additionally, the idea of limited government, that we should put strong limits on the power of the governments, particularly the federal government, in order to avoid concentration of power and the potential for tyranny there. Next document we had was the United States Constitution from 1789 is when it's ratified. And we saw that the articles have been a failure. We've discussed that at length about the inability to raise sufficient taxes, to coordinate defense, to coordinate economic activity, and so on and so forth. Now, this Constitution comes in, it goes against the articles. It says, actually, we've got to concentrate a little more power into the federal government, but it comes at a time where there's still a strong suspicion of a strong central government, and thus we see 2 main ideas outlined in there. The first one is the idea of separation of powers, originally brought up by the Baron Montesquieu. We see this by the separation into the 3 separate branches, each of them with clearly defined powers for the most part, that overlap in some areas, so that no one area of the government could become too powerful, and that these 3 branches would be somewhat in competition in order to reduce each one from becoming tyrannical. And then simultaneously, we see it with the concept of checks and balances, which are littered throughout the Constitution, where at each point, if there's a major decision to be made, for example, the appointment of a Supreme Court justice, the other branches would have a way to check each other about doing this. So in the Supreme Court justice example, the president would be the one who nominates somebody for the appointment, but the Senate would have to confirm, thus putting a check on presidential power. We see this, usually it is between the 3 branches, but state governments at a certain point are provided opportunities to put a check on the power of the federal government, as we've seen quite recently with election powers, which are conducted by the states. Our next document, this was in the period where the ratification of the Constitution was taking place, was Brutus number 1. Brutus from the Anti-Federalists, the group who were against the Constitution. The main ideas here are the idea about representation and whether the government truly represents the people. Brutus approaches it from what we would call these days the elite and class theory, where they said that actually the power is too concentrated in the hands of the wealthy. By limiting the number of positions, only wealthy people could really take them, and thus it's not a truly representative government. Also, Brutus brings up the idea of limited government again, and it said that the Constitution has a few loopholes that would erode the limits on its power. So they believe that the power to tax, the necessary and proper clause, and to a certain extent the commerce clause, would allow for the federal government to continue to grow until it would dwarf the power of the states. So both of those ideas. Then we had Federalist 10, which was a Federalist response, James Madison, to Brutus number 1, and the idea of factions, and that there would be different groups that would rise up that would be problematic. In Federalist 10, Madison says these factions are bad, but they are inevitable. There's nothing you can do about it. People will separate into different groups naturally. So what we should do is put forward the idea of pluralism. So pluralism is where the groups will be in a marketplace of ideas, a competition scenario, but in a way that every group can have a voice within the government. So the way to do this would be to have many, many elected positions across the country between both the state and the federal government, and that this would allow each faction opportunity to be represented. What we're going to do now is look at Federalist 51, our newest document, and we're going to have a detailed breakdown about Federalist 51. So once again, this is James Madison, and he's talking a little bit about the separation of powers here. So he said, basically, each branch should be independent from each other. They should not rely on each other too much, and they shouldn't be able to select the members of the other branches wherever possible. All right, this way, the court is not, doesn't owe the president anything, or members of the Senate don't owe the court fealty, things like that. All right, fealty, I'll explain, is like loyalty. Okay, so he said that if we followed this to its logical conclusion, every single position would be selected by the voters, by the citizens of the country. Every president, every legislator, every judge would be. However, there's some practical issues. And the main area where there's a practical issue would be the judiciary. The founders were against the idea of elected judges because it said that the average person just doesn't know what makes a good judge. And so it becomes a popularity contest rather than selecting people who are legal experts and the highest level of legal expert. So what should happen? We have a conundrum. We want to have high quality judges, which can only be identified by experts, but we also want those judges to be independent and not feel like they owe particular politicians any favors, and so on. So how do they do this? The first thing they did was they said, let's make the judges lifetime appointments. This way they'll never have to run for re-election, and as a result, they shouldn't be influenced by the president nor the senators who are responsible for their position. They shouldn't be loyal to them because once they got the job, they can do whatever they want. As nobody can remove them, they never have to run for re-election. All right, then Federalist 51 shifts a little bit, and it talks about abuse of power. It says, we don't like to think that people abuse power, but it's going to happen. If we didn't abuse power, we wouldn't need a government at all. We wouldn't need any rules. Right? So it said that men are imperfect. We recognize that all men are imperfect. All people, humans, are imperfect. So what we have to do is create a government that can control itself, that can identify bad actors and limit their power and remove them if they're acting against the general good. So this is once again a little bit about limited government and a bit of checks and powers. So dividing power, separation of powers there is one way to control against bad actors, because no one actor can get too much power. However, that's not going to be enough, according to Madison. He said that we got some other issues. So he's worried a little bit, first, that the legislative branch should be the one that is most powerful, and that if you got a group of bad people in there, that could be really bad. So they decided to split that, put another separation of power in there by creating both the House of Representatives and the Senate. This is another example of separating powers and checks and balances there. And also by changing the way the elections happen for each. If you remember, originally, House members are directly elected, whereas Senate members are appointed by the state government. We once again put another separation and check onto the powers there. However, we get into our main idea, which is that sometimes there is, within representative democracy, there's the tendency of the group that has the power, the majority, to use their power to limit the rights of minority groups. And once again, when we talk about minorities, we're talking about any group that is less than the ruling party. All right, so we're not just talking about ethnic minorities, we're talking about political minorities and so on and so forth. So what can we do to prevent this idea, this tyranny of the majority and oppression of minority groups? So there's two real ways to do it. The first one is to have a great community. We'll have everyone working together. However, that's not necessarily going to work. And so what do? We want to try to make it where there are so many different positions, once again, that it's very difficult for one group to dominate all of the government. So by separating the powers over and over again, by putting lots of checks and balances in there, it means that if, for example, you have a corrupt president who wishes to dominate, he would still rely on the House and the Senate and the courts and the state governments, all of these, to be able to carry out what he wants to do. And they're going to make it difficult. It's going to be very unlikely for that to happen. Right? So once again, we see the main idea of Federalist 51 is this idea of pluralism, that by having lots of different positions in there, we're going to prevent tyranny of the majority. Thank you.